Good morning. Welcome to the Lasagna Garden Composting webinar. I am Pete Dubois. I work for Clark County Public Health, and I coordinate the Master Composter Recycler program. And today we're going to talk about one of my favorite ways to compost called Lasagna Garden Composting. It's also known as sheet composting or sheet mulching. It's a layered approach. We're not growing lasagna, but we are, just as you make lasagna in layers, we're going to be making a garden with our composting layers, our greens and browns that we talk about in composting. So we're going to share some techniques and tips and successes that we've had, and I'm sure once you start this, you'll be like us and you won't turn back. So our learning objectives today are going to be how to build a lasagna garden. So we've talked about how to compost in your backyard bin, whether you are actively in hot composting or you are passively or cold composting, as we call it, the dump and run method. You can also compost in your worm bin using red worms. Well, this is a way that you can actually have your garden be your compost bin. And so it's really exciting. And we're excited to share how successful we've been doing this. And we're going to talk about how you can plant it and then how to maintain it. And here's a picture of one of the lasagna gardens that we built at our demonstration site where we teach folks how to compost. We use some old pallets for our raised bed. And you can see we have filled this bed with probably 18 inches of pure compost through this process. And our plants love it. We actually grew chard one summer long through hot summer days with absolutely no water. So we're going to talk about how these mulching gardens also are incredible for holding onto the rainwater and requiring much less watering. They also have you ever tried to dig into hard packed soil to remove a weed or even put in your shovel? You know it can be very challenging to get penetration into that. Well, this is a loose, friable, fluffy compost soil, so easy to pull weeds and maintain your garden. Also, one of the most magical things about these gardens that we'll get into a little bit is we're creating a habitat and environment, just like we do in our compost bins and our worm bins, where we're going to invite these composting critters, whether they are the fungi, the bacteria, the invertebrates, as we like to call them, the FBI, and also our red worm friends will arrive. And they are going to transform these waste products, some of which might have even been going to the landfill, into a life force that is chock full of nutrients and things that our plants want and will make them strong, healthy, disease resistant, and nutritious as well. So we are growing healthy soil to feed healthy people. And I've got a question for you. Here I am in front of a lasagna garden that I built in my backyard, and it's a super simple technique. And have you ever thought about removing sod? Like if I were to put in another garden bed in front of this one, you can see I'm standing on grass. So just the thought of actually having to dig up all that grass, or somehow getting heavy equipment in there to rototill through that material. Some folks talk about digging and even double digging. Does that sound labor intensive? Does that sound like the kind of garden effort you want to put in to build your raised bed garden? Because I know for me, I'm much more into simplicity. And if I can also get all of these amazing microorganisms to work right where I put them, where I want my garden to be, I am so far ahead of the game that my garden's producing right away. In fact, you can plant the day you build your lasagna garden, and you will see amazing results. So I've built about 20 of these lasagna gardens out at our demonstration sites in my backyard. I've had 100% success. We will talk about some tips and tricks and also experiences that I've learned as we go through and when we finish up with some of our frequently asked questions. But we do encourage you to be in touch with us if you've got concerns or questions or you see things in the field. We'd love to hear from you as well. I don't want you to feel like you're going to need to scavenge and collect all the materials that we do. We have a video in our resources as well. But scavenging can be a very useful practice in composting. And if you can amass a pile of materials, it will make building your lasagna garden a lot easier. So we're going to talk about the step-by-step approach on how to build a lasagna garden, but it is important as a gardener to, first of all, ask yourself what it is you want to grow. Are you wanting to grow vegetables or fruit trees, maybe some perennial flowers, even shrubs? And where are you going to put your garden? And so walking around in your backyard, looking at the sun and how many hours you get of sunshine. Is there shade trees, trees that will grow up over time and shade your garden? So it is important to plan in advance. You might even want to take out some paper and pencil and chart out how things are going to grow over time, so that your garden is going to get the sunlight it needs and be in the position that you want it to be. Because it's going to take a little bit to put this in, and you certainly want it to be successful. Also, how big do you want your garden to be? This one's typically about 4 feet by 8 feet. It's a little bit bigger than that, but that's kind of our standard size that we'll talk about just for materials and collecting items to build. So let's launch into it. So here I am again, I'm standing on the grass, and we're gonna put our lasagna garden right where I'm standing. And we're also gonna show you some pictures from a demo site where we built a lasagna garden as well. So here we are out at our demo site. We're putting down our first layer. This is the weed barrier layer. We do this one time to suppress the weeds or grass. You could, as I said, you could build this right on a driveway if you wanted to. And there are a few weeds that are very pernicious. If you've got bindweed, even Canada thistle, this will certainly make it harder for them, but they may keep popping up. So for the most part, you're going to be able to suppress weeds. You're going to certainly be able to suppress grass if you follow these techniques. We're going to layer our cardboard. You can use newspaper as well. If you are using newspaper, it needs to be very thick. You know, we recommend 10, even 15 pages thick. And for the cardboard layer, pretty much one layer of cardboard is going to be fine. You would want to make sure to overlap so there's no light, no way for our weeds and grass to grow up through our pile. So here we are in my backyard. Again, we're starting to take form on what our garden will look like. And I actually used brown paper bags that I had and lots of newspaper, and you can see how thick it is. You can also see that this material is wet. That's actually helpful so it won't blow away. And it's also very important when we are building our lasagna garden. We want all of our layers to be wet. I will continuously say this: wet, damp, moist. And the reasons for that are we want this pile to decompose and break down over time. If you're doing it on a hot, sunny day, like here I am in my shorts, I actually was spraying the grass area to get that drenched and wet and soggy. Then I put my cardboard newspaper, very thick layer overlapping on top of that, got that all wet as well. The wetter it is, the quicker it will break down. If you've ever tried spraying a piece of dry cardboard, you can see the water just fly right off it. That's called hydrophobic. But as that material starts to get decomposed, it will hold on to that moisture. And if you've ever had a soggy piece of cardboard, you know that you can rip it into tiny pieces very easily. So that's the effect we're looking for our weed barrier. Our second layer is going to be for aeration. We like to think of this as kind of pickup sticks. So if you've got a bunch of prunings in the spring, if you're pruning your fruit trees, this is a perfect way to get rid of those materials. If you've got any kind of brush piles that you've kept in your yard, some of those are great for habitat, but also some can be used in this, really just cleaning up around your yard. It's a great way to just pull out large stemmy weeds, pine cones, whatever you've got. As long as they're not super thick, this material will provide aeration and also provide more slower breakdown for our fungus and some of the other materials and critters that come in. So we're creating kind of a long-term food source for some of those critters as well. And your stick layer really, it's going to be just a covering. You know, it could be 2 inches high. It could be thicker, really doesn't matter, up to 4 inches. So if you've got a lot of twigs you want to get rid of and you're going to build a big lasagna garden, then you certainly can have that be a pretty big layer. I went pretty thin on mine. Really doesn't matter. You can see I've got my hose out there. Every layer I put down, I'm adding more water to it. And then we get into the building of our green and brown layers. So in this case, we did 4 total layers, layers 3 through 6, which would be 2 greens and 2 browns. Doesn't matter the order. It could be brown, it could be green, but we do want to alternate those. And we'll talk about in composting lingo what the composting greens and composting browns are. These layers can go on because we're doing more of a passive cold composting. It's a little more forgiving. So in terms of thickness, you know, you want to cover your whole bed. So it's going to probably be a good 2 to 4 inches, as much as 6 inches of material. And some examples of our composting greens, we have in the top right would be some fruit and vegetable trimmings. This is immediate food for our critters, easy to break down. It's kind of like sugar. You can think of this as like jelly donuts for our microorganisms. They are going to go to town and feast on this. Our greens are the nitrogen, and they help our microorganisms basically recreate and have their population explosions. They need this to build their structure. So a very important component of our building. And we're creating habitat, and we're actually putting in food to feed these microorganisms, which are going to devour all this material. All these different colors you see on this page are going to turn into that brown, fluffy, life supporting soil, humus that we call compost. On the other top, on the left, we've got manure. And we certainly, any kind of livestock manure for the most part, folks that are eating more of a vegetarian diet, cows, horses, llamas, sheep, goats, chickens, all of those materials from them are going to be great. Chicken manure is very hot, which means it's high in nitrogen. So if you're going to put that in and plant your garden right away, you might want to make sure that you're doing thinner layers. And if you're using manure in general in a lasagna garden, it's probably a good practice to let that age in your lasagna garden before you plant. As I said, you can plant the day you build this, but if you do have manure, best practices are to let that age 3 or 4 months. So you might want to build your pile and let it overwinter and then plant it in the spring. And that's just because of E. coli and some other concerns of pathogens that might come in with your manure. It is good to know about your manure source as well. There are a few chemical pesticide sprays that can persist. They're rare. Also in horses, they might use dewormers. We haven't found that to be a problem because our microorganisms are amazing at breaking down chemicals and compounds and can break that down over time. On our lower left, we've got grass clippings. If possible, and you have a mulching mower, to just leave those grass clippings on your lawn. They have an NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, our basic fertilizer of about 412. So it actually is a fertilizer. Those materials are mostly water and will break down and feed your grass. If you have extra grass clippings and they haven't been treated with weed and feed, or if they have, maybe your second or third cutting, ideally your third cutting, those materials would be great in your lasagna garden. And then we've just got a bucket full of our garden and yard waste. Any kind of weedy material is going to be great. Again, if you're going to put in things with weed seeds, our lasagna compost and lasagna garden is a passive, cool composting technique, so it's not going to heat up and kill any weed seeds. So what you put in is what you get out. And then coffee, and I know we've talked, coffee is brown, but in composting lingo, it is a green because it is a nitrogen, it is a moist, it's kind of a wetter material. And this is a great source of green that you can get from really any local cafe or coffee shop, especially some of them you can talk to and bring them your own buckets and they'll fill it up and you can come pick it back up. You can use, I have built entire lasagna garden beds with leaves and coffee grounds. So coffee grounds being my one green item, maybe 40 buckets worth. So it is amazing how much coffee is out there in our community, and a lot of that ends up in the landfill, which is sad. So that's a good source as well. And we don't recommend any types of cat or dog waste in any of our composting systems. They have pathogens. That is just a material that's best put into the trash or managed in a very specific way. So our composting browns, these are going to be our dry carbon materials. So we talked a little bit about the green and the protein and how that's important for the reproduction and the population growth of our critters. Our bacteria, just in a teaspoon of our soil and healthy compost, we can have 1 billion critters in their microorganisms. So these populations of bacteria, the fungi, the nematodes, all that are living in our soil, they need this food, protein and carbon. So on our brown side, the carbon is their energy. It's actually the food that they're going to take just to keep them energized. If you are going to use cardboard, we've talked a little bit about that for the mulch layer. We do recommend using brown cardboard if you can. And what we wouldn't want necessarily would be like a white shiny with lots of color, maybe something you buy your flat screen TV in. That might just have a little too much going on in it. So cardboard, again, is going to need to be in smaller pieces. Our shredded paper is great. Our microorganisms are magicians at taking care of any chemical compounds and breaking these materials down into usable foods for themselves. And what they can't break down over time becomes this wonderful structural humus. And leaves, one of my favorite. One of the best times to build a lasagna garden would be in the fall. You can use leaves for all of your brown layers. This is a material that you can also collect and gather and save up and use throughout the year. We like to turn it into leaf mold. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Newspaper, another great source of brown material. It can be put into strips very easily. Most of the inks are soy-based and they'll break down over time. And then we have straw. And straw has the seed head removed from it, which would be hay if it has the seeds still on it. And hay, if it's freshly cut, would be a green. We don't talk too much about hay just because of the potential for weeds. I know they have certified weed-free hay. That would be great to use. But in our case, we're mostly talking about straw, which has the seed cut off of it, seed head cut off, and is like an actual straw where you can almost put it into your milkshake and drink out of it. So it's hollow. So those are our greens and our browns that we're going to use. And we are going to show you a couple examples. So here's a green layer that I put in right on top of my twigs. And it was in the spring. I built this about 1 year ago in May. And we'll show you a sample in the video clip of how this broke down just in a year's time. And this is some large chard that was kind of going to seed. Because this is a passive pile, we have a little more leeway. I didn't really need to chop this into those 2 to 4 inch pieces. If I were to put this in my compost bin, as you can see kind of in the back there, I would want these to be in smaller pieces. But in a lasagna garden, it's a little bit more like a lazy man's gardening. You just throw the stuff right on top and it's going to break down over time. Now I'm putting on some shredded paper. You can see also, it looks like I put down some food scraps on top of that chard. The hose is there because I'm making sure every layer is wet and moist and damp. We really can't have too much water, as I've stressed before, unless it's puddling and starting to run off your site. Then you know you have too much. And I also put some sawdust, which was actually part of a mushroom growing medium. So they're growing mushrooms out of this sawdust, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides. So that was also a brown material. And now I'm coming back on to cover up with a green. And I've got my coffee buckets going. And I'm dumping that out. Looks like I dumped quite a few buckets of coffee. And then I've got some more food waste on top of that. So I have completed my green layer, a brown layer, and a green layer. And in this case, that's all that I did on that one. So you can certainly keep going as many green browns as you'd like. But you do want to get it to at least 12 inches high, maybe as high as 24 inches would be a great looking lasagna garden. So we're going to talk just a little bit now that you've got your layers of greens and browns in place with our top layer. And this is important because this is where ultimately we're going to be planting our material, whether it's our transplants or our seeds, or we're going to be putting rows of seeds in. And if you're going to plant your lasagna garden the actual same day or very soon after you've built your compost garden, you're going to need 2 to 4 inches of soil or compost, which makes sense. If you wanted to dig a little row, you'd need a little bit of top dressing to dig into. And if you're also going to plant a transplant, you need to be able to pull back some of that material and place it in and cover it back up with your compost. And we'll talk about that when you're planting your garden. And then if you've got seeds, you'd want more of a fine compost or material on top for that seed to germinate in. And if you're going to overwinter, let's say you build your lasagna garden in the fall, you can just layer it up with straight leaves or straw or a combination and let that sit all winter long. And then in the spring, you're actually going to have your top dressing right there for you, which is the simplest of all ways to do your lasagna garden bed. So I covered my bed. I had some leaf mold, which is just a practice of taking 100% leaves and putting them in a pile or a big black bag and letting them sit. And these sat for about 6 months. So you can see that they are a little bit chunky, but that is my garden bed. You can see that was pretty easy. We just did our newspaper, kind of weed suppression. We had our twigs, and then we did the chard and some shredded paper and food scraps and coffee to cover it. And then we put our leaves on, and we're about 12-inch, 14-inch high raised bed garden, really, that I made in about 45 minutes. This is about a 4-foot by 8-foot bed, give or take. And if you're going to be building a lasagna garden and you are doing it in the fall, of course, you could just cover it with leaves that you have on hand. But if it is something that you want to plant in more quickly, you would need to have compost. And that's why it's a wonderful opportunity to pair this process and technique up with your backyard composting. And if you've got a couple wheelbarrows full of compost, this is a great time to spread it on top of your lasagna garden as your top layer. And a wheelbarrow is about 5 cubic feet, 5 to 6 cubic feet. And so if you were needing to import your compost by the bag from a garden store or a home improvement store, you would need about 2 wheelbarrows load. So that'd be 10 to 12 cubic feet, give or take, depending on the size of your garden bed. But of course, being a composter, you should have compost on hand, and it is a wonderful way to put that beautiful soil to work for you in your garden. And I've talked quite a bit about leaf mold. Leaf mold is a way to turn 100% leaves into compost. And if you can plan ahead, in the fall, you gather up leaves, you can go around to your neighbors. If you see folks that have craft-filled bags outside, you can ask them if you can take their leaves. I typically always have at least one large pile of leaves going in my backyard. So in a year's time, I'll have rich, crumbly leaf compost, which is great for potting soil. It's great for covering your lasagna garden. If you're going to make your lasagna garden in the spring, you still can use it. It just needs a little more time to break down. The other thing you can do is just get some heavy-duty black contractor bags, fill them up with your leaves. They need to be moist. Poke some holes in it, kind of like you might do with a baked potato covered in tin foil and put in the oven. And then set that out of sight, ideally in a place that's shady. And in a year's time, you come back and you've got a bag of compost. So that way you don't need to import and spend money on bags of compost. The leaves also are high in minerals, and so you're getting all of that added nutritional value, Plus, you just know exactly what's going into your garden. You're going to be growing food, hopefully, that you're going to eat. And you're going to feel so great about having this nutritional amendment and soil that you've built yourself in all these different techniques. I like to add, because I've got this amazing vermicompost that I make, you can add all of your nutritional needs for 3 months with just 1 gallon of this material. So little goes a long way. What I do, and you'll see in the resource video that we have with this webinar, I sprinkle about 1 gallon of this under the top covering of my lasagna garden, just to add that nitrogen, the phosphate, the potassium, plus all the micronutrients and what comes out of the worm, which is the worm casting or this vermicompost. It's alive in bacteria, and it's going to be a food available nutrient for your plants. So getting that where those roots are going to go is a way to make really healthy and happy plants. And we talked just a little bit about how to plant. We will demonstrate this again in the video. So you should have enough of this compost, leaf mold, soil to have 2 to 4 inches, 3 to 5 inches of material that you can actually, on the right here, just kind of go in with your hands and pull back a hole, and then you put your transplant right in there and bring the hole back and cover it up with your compost and pat it down. So these are beds that we built the same day that we are planting. They will require some water, just as any new start would, but we're going to have all of that moisture being held in by this giant mulch pile that we just built. And remember, we kept all those layers really wet, so there's a lot of moisture, like a giant sponge, held up in this lasagna garden. So it's going to really provide moisture, it's going to provide the nutrients we need, and these plants do amazingly well. And again, I've built over 20 of these gardens. Some we've planted right away, some we've mulched and come back and planted in the spring. We've had amazing results. If you're going to plant just seeds, then you would want to probably have a more fine, maybe a sifted compost or leaf mold that you put on, or soil, and then cover that up, of course, pat it down, and keep it nice and watered. So again, what's really fascinating, and it makes sense, is once we build our pile, these materials are going to be consumed by our microorganisms. And just like leaves when they fall out of a tree, and if you don't rake them up, you know, they disappear over time. And you ask the question, well, where did they go? The decomposers will bring that material back into the soil. And so our bed will sink 40 to 50%. Basically, it will shrink down. And over time, if you don't do anything, it will actually shrink all the way back down to the level that you started. It's pretty amazing how all this material gets worked down into the soil over time. So adding layers to your bed will be something that you might want to do. And some other ideas you can do in the fall, winter, you could plant a cover crop that keeps your life force, and it's going to feed the roots, and the photosynthesis is going to take that energy from the sun and create those sugars to keep all your critters happy, and also fix nitrogen into your soil. So cover cropping is a wonderful thing to do. Also, just mulching it with leaves and straw and letting that dead matter decompose and break down is another great thing to do. In the springtime, again, we'll just weed, and we can add more soil and compost if we want. or you can just rake back the leaf and straw mulch that you had, any of the chunky things, so you've got more of a fine soil that you can either cover with seeds or put your row in, cover that up, plant your seeds into, or as we talked about, just pull back the holes and do your transplants as well. We do not do that cardboard and aeration layer. That's a one-time deal. One thing I like to do in the fall with my lasagna gardens is it's also a time where you're mowing the lawn. So I will put down a layer of green grass, and then of course I've got leaves I cover with brown. I can do that 2 or 3 times. Grass, leaves. And then, as I said, that all breaks down, and in the spring, you're ready to plant your garden. A couple added layers that I did on my bed that I built in my backyard. I had a bunch of apple pressings from a cider press party, so that was great. And I covered that with some coffee grounds you can see in the middle. Those are buckets of coffee. And then I took more of my leaf mold and covered that as my brown material. So basically a layer of green, the apple and the coffee, and then a layer of brown, my leaf mold. And 1 month later, from that sawdust, if you remember in the previous slide, with the mushroom mycelia, I had about 4 to 5 pounds of blue oyster mushrooms spring up from this bed that was just built in May, and here we are in October. So I'm already getting amazing benefits out of these lasagna compost gardens. Oh, and in the bottom there, you can see all of the squash that we had pulled off as well. So we're immediately getting squashes and then mushrooms. So a quick review. We're going to start with our layer that suppresses, kills the grass. Typically we'll use cardboard, big pieces, make sure that they're wet and moist and damp. Or you can use very thick layers of newspaper and make sure that it's overlapped. Then we're going to put on our pickup stick layer for aeration. And those would be small to medium twigs or branches. There is a technique called hugelkultur where they actually use giant logs and they bury those and then build a garden above that. And that waterlogged log will actually hold the moisture and that starts to break down. So this is almost like a little mini hugelkultur, and that's a cool thing to look into as well. Then we go with our layers of green and brown. And we certainly are going to do probably 4 layers total, at least, for building our lasagna garden. And then we can continue to add those layers each year. That's going to bring in more nutrients. It's going to bring in more food for our microorganisms. It's going to keep our raised bed above the ground. And just another way of incorporating those composted materials into your life. So now you've got them in your backyard compost bin, you've got them in your worm bin, and now you've actually got them in your gardens. And that should go, to at least 8 inches high. We like more like 12 or 14 because it is going to sink so far. And then our last layer that we talked about is going to be that planting layer where ideally you'll have your compost that you've made in your backyard. You can maybe sprinkle in some of your worm castings that you've got from your worm bin. And then you can cover that in an ideal world with your leaf mold that you've collected from your neighborhood and your backyard trees. And you really can utilize all of our composting systems. I bring in about 30 of those craft bags full of leaves each year. I go around, load up my car 4 or 5 times. Actually have neighbors now who expect me to come. I will dump out the leaves, give them back their craft bags. They fill them up again. And that material really breaks down about, almost 10 to 1. So you put in 10 bags of leaves and you get 1 bag of compost, leaf compost out. So that material continues to sink as you're adding it. I also like to use an activator to get my leaf compost going a little faster, which we all have access to. And in potty lingo, it's called number 1. So that's what we're talking about with our layers. And that's our lasagna garden. Really, we're just collecting up materials, some that were headed to the landfill, some that we can scavenge around the city, whether it's shredded paper or cardboard or coffee grounds from the local cafe, fruits and vegetables. You can often get by talking to your grocers, or you can actually go onto some apps on the web. There's 2. One is sharewaste.com. There's also makesoil.org. Those are ways that you can actually reach out to your neighbors and have them bring you their food scraps. And I have 5 customers who swap out buckets, and we have a system, so I know when those materials arrive, so I can keep making more compost and adding that to my garden every year. Couple quick questions that come up, and we welcome any questions from you. That really helps us as well. Before I get into this, a question that does pop up is, what about moles and voles? And should you put something under your lasagna garden? As I said, I've built 20 plus lasagna gardens, and I've never had problems with moles or voles. I have seen them in the grass lawn very close by, so I know they're active and around, but for one reason or another, they're not messing with my garden, thankfully. So if we do experience that, we will update our information, and if you do, we'd love to hear that as well. Okay, can you build your lasagna bed inside a wood, concrete raised bed, other materials? And we think that's awesome. Just like in our first slide where we had our pallet raised bed garden, maybe you've got a cedar raised bed box. This is a great way, rather than importing 18, 16, 12 inches of soil material and soil blend to plant your garden, you can actually just cover the grass with cardboard and then start putting in your twigs and then your green and brown layers. And then all you need is 2 to 4 inches, ideally, of compost that you've got, or fewer bags that you need to import. And that's going to save you money. And we have found, again, that by doing this mulch layering approach, you also get more nutrients, you don't need to water as much, and you're going to have healthier, happier plants. So you win in so many different ways. And do you need a huge variety of greens and browns? Sometimes we recommend that if you're making your compost in a backyard bin, just to introduce some more biodiversity, but really not necessary even there. And certainly not in a lasagna garden. You can build it with leaves being your brown material, and coffee. If you had 40 buckets full of coffee, you could build an entire lasagna garden with just coffee and leaves. And can you add materials over perennials? So I have actually planted a cut flower garden with my most recent lasagna garden. And so I'm not going to put layers of greens and browns over that because they're perennial and I want them to come back every year. So as they come up, I might spread some mulch around in kind of more of a donut, they call it. So I'm not up against the roots or the stem, and then continue to add mulch. But what you plant is going to be important to how you add those layers. And you have to assemble everything at once. You'll see in the video resource that I did accumulate all my materials at one time so I could have my garden built and planted all the same day. That certainly is a great way to do things, but we know not everyone can amass those materials or has built up their sources yet, like a secret fishing hole of getting their compost materials. So I also have some very large lasagna gardens that I'm building, and it just takes me a long time to get it all covered with one layer of green, and then typically the brown layer is pretty fast because that's just going to be shredded paper. And so really it depends on your situation. And then you don't have enough compost for that top, and here we're saying 3 to 5 inches. Again, what can I do? And if you have that opportunity to plant in advance in the fall, just stockpile leaves, either in a bin or in those black heavy-duty contractor bags with some holes poked in it. Make sure it's moist and out of the sunshine, and you're going to have your own bags of compost. Now, clearly that's planning in advance, so the same would be true if you could make batches of backyard compost. Again, you know exactly what's in that material, and you know how healthy it is. Every teaspoon of that soil is going to have over 1 billion living organisms in it. But if you don't have those opportunities, you certainly can go and buy bags of compost. You can have compost delivered, or you can do soil. And we don't recommend fill soil just because you can bring in noxious weeds and worse. So we've covered a lot of ground, and I really appreciate having this opportunity to talk about lasagna compost gardening. As I said, it really does bring all of these techniques together to grow and bring you food and flowers and fruits and real gardening pleasure. If you've got questions, feel free to send them to us, mcr@clark.wa.gov. That is a phone number as well. You can leave messages or reach me. And our website is clarkcountycompost.org. I also am composting.pete on Instagram. This is a quick little photo of the materials that I amassed for the lasagna garden that we build in the video part of this webinar, which we encourage you to watch as well, so you can see the actual techniques of us building our lasagna compost. And we did it in 50 minutes, and it's planted, and we have a raised bed, and it's going to be providing these amazing nutrients to our microorganism friends and our lovely earthworms. So again, thank you so much for coming out to the Lasagna Garden Composting webinar, and we hope to see you back soon. I'm Pete Dubois. Happy gardening.